लखनऊ के बारे में तारीख़ लखनऊ में मैं पढ़ रहा था और 4 जुमलों में उसने लिखा है कि जिस तरह बारात में दूल्हा होता है, चमन में गुल, फूल में खुशबू, चराग में लौ, जिस्म में रूह, आँख में नूर, दिल में सुरूर, सीपी में मोती, नाव में लंगर की जो शान होती है वही ज़मीन लखनऊ की है। मैं बग़ैर किसी ताख़ीर के डॉक्टर रोज़ी लेवलन जोन्स MBE जो हमारे दरमियान है, उन्होंने हमारी दावत को कबूल किया है। रोज़ी इज़ एन अथॉरिटी ऑन लखनऊ एंड शी हैज़ एक्सटेंसिवली रिटन and in this auditorium I remember her book was launched, The Lucknow, the City of Illusion. She has recently written another book, The Last King of India, The Great Uprising, Engaging Scoundrels. She studied Indian languages at SWAS and she was awarded MBE for her services to the British Association of Cemeteries in South Asia and British Indian Studies. I very humbly request Rosie to come and make her presentation. और जब ये गुफ्तगू करेंगी तो ये हमें याद दिलाएंगी सारे नक्शे सामने आँखों के हैं, सारे नक्शे सामने आँखों के हैं, नक्श हैं नक्शे और निगारे लखनऊ.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I say to you, adab. It's a cold evening outside, but let's see if we can bring some of Lucknow's warmth to South Audley Street. So, Wajid Ali Shah, Lucknow ke Akhri Nawab, or Hindustan ke Akhri King. And the reason he is the last king in India, which was the title of my book, this was an English title bestowed by the East India Company. And he was the only ruler in India who was actually given the English title of king, not Raja or Nawab, but king. And the good thing is that while writing my recent book, a lot of pictures of him came to light, things we hadn't seen before. I think most of you probably know his tragic history. Coming to the throne as a young man, he really never stood a chance because the British resident in Lucknow and the Governor-General doomed him from the start. Even before he took up the throne, they said he is full of vice, he's engaged in debauchery and that kind of thing. They couldn't really say anything good enough about it, so it was a foregone conclusion that the British wanted of it because it was an extraordinarily rich province. And by 1856 they had annexed it. The king valiantly held out against signing a treaty handing his kingdom over. And when the fatal moment came and the resident said, "You have to hand it over," Wajid Ali Shah took the turban off his head and placed it in the resident's hands as a sign of submission. And the sad story is that he then, a month later, went to Calcutta. He was not exiled. This is a mistake people often make. He went to Calcutta of his own volition with his mother and his brother and his son and about 300 followers. And the reason he went was that he planned to go to Queen Victoria in London and to appeal to her to give him back his throne. He never got as far as London, but he sent his mother and his brother and his son, and very tragically both his mother and his brother died in Europe, and his mother is buried in Père Lachaise cemetery. Wajid Ali Shah was imprisoned during the Great Uprising. He was in Fort William for 2 years until let out by the British, and he then settled at Garden Reach in Calcutta, where he lived for 30 years, and that's where he passed away. So I'm going to show you mainly images of the king, and here is one. This is what I mean by saying that images came to light that we didn't know about. This was recently identified. It's in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. It is perhaps a rather flattering portrait, but it does show the king as a young man, and it's painted on ivory. It had not previously been identified. And here is another picture which came to light actually through a descendant, a direct descendant of Wajid Ali Shah. When I was researching, I interviewed him, and he suddenly brought out this rather nice little picture, quite badly damaged. But it's important because it shows Wajid Ali Shah, the father of Wajid Ali Shah, with his 4 sons. And at first we thought this is interesting, but later realised that it had actually been painted quite some time after the uprising, and in fact the figures here are based on photographs that were taken about 1858. But nevertheless, it is a very nice portrait. Wajid Ali Shah is standing to the side of his father, his brother is next to him, and his 2 other brothers on the other side. It is supposed to be the moment when he was declared the Wali Ahad, the heir apparent. And here is a very rare photograph of Wajid Ali Shah with a young daughter and one of his numerous wives. As you probably know, he had a huge number of wives, I think about 372 at the last count, which is, if you think about it, it's more than 1 for every day of the year. And this, we think, is probably his 2nd official wife, Akhtar Mahal, and a young daughter. And it's interesting because it's almost the only photograph we have from before the uprising. You can see Wajid Ali Shah sitting there with his very long, elaborate ringlets. And have a look at the headdress that Akhtar Mahal is wearing. It's curious, but it looks as though the hair was sort of looped up on top and then covered with brocade. And in fact, we can see that more clearly in this painting. Again, the painting is not in very good condition. It's in Banarsi Bagh, Lucknow Museum. But we can see here more clearly this sort of curious headdress of the women. And of course we can see Wajid Ali Shah's ringlets, and as we saw in the photograph, quite accurate actually. So here he is in his zanana, surrounded by just a few of his many wives. And again, this is something that came to light. It's a beautifully illustrated manuscript, and it's in the library of Windsor Castle, so it belongs to the Queen, and it's called the Ishqnama, which is something like the Chronicle of Love, the Chronicle of Passion. And what it is an illustrated autobiography written by the king when he was still a young man. We think it was written about 1848, a year or so after he came to the throne. And although it's called the Chronicle of Passion, it's not really erotic, but what it does show are numerous women who subsequently go on to become wives to the king. So it's a kind of diary of who he's married, if you like. And Safraz Mahal, who's shown here, was a favourite for many, many years. And unfortunately, something went wrong with this romance. She was left behind, like many of the other women, when Wajid Ali Shah went to Kolkata. And years later, he was asked if he would give her a small pension. She was by then very hard up. He said, certainly not. No, absolutely not. She was only the wife of a tailor, and by taking her as my wife, I actually made her a respectable woman, but she ran off with one of my musicians. And it's true, she went off with Ghulam Ali, who was an extremely handsome musician. I think one can't blame her. And there's just one more. I find this fascinating. I'm absolutely surprised this hasn't made more stir. This is the only authentic portrait of Begum Hazrat Mahal, one of the great freedom fighters during the uprising of 1857 to 58. Has her name at the top. This is very characteristic. Wajid Ali Shah is sitting under a shamiana, and the women are approaching him, and they're all wearing the same costumes with those rather ridiculous curled up shoes, and it's almost like an audition. The women are auditioning to be his wives, and of course if they could sing and dance at the same time, that was an added bonus. And the interesting thing about Begum Hazrat Mahal is that an Indian scholar actually discovered her father was an African slave. So she's half African, something which has not come out, is not really known. So, as I say, I was very pleased to find that, but rather surprised it hadn't made more of a stir. People are still trotting out the old, better-known reproductions of Begum Hazrat Mahal. And this is Hyderabad, the heart of Lucknow, the magic fairyland. This is a large painting, and what it shows is one of Wajid Ali Shah's entertainments. And to call it an entertainment is perhaps not to give it its full import. He wrote a series of masnavis which were then set to music, so it's like musical performances, and they went on for a very long time. It took almost a month to go through every scene. Obviously people weren't sitting there for a month. They would come every night or every other night, and there would be a new scene from the plays. They're all terribly romantic, like Darya-e-Ishq, the river of love, and that kind of thing. I think you've got the idea now. Love is the theme. And this actually shows some places in Hyderabad, the main square, which we can even now identify. To the right we can see the Lanka, which was replaced by the Aminadola Public Library. And we can see the Safed Baradari in the middle, which is now probably, as you know, used for weddings and celebrations. And to the far side, the rather sad little canal with a bridge going over it, which still exists, though in very mutilated form. But this is a scene full of colour and life, and the king has just been brought in. He's being carried on an open palanquin by some of his ladies. It's a wonderful picture. I think any of you who are familiar with Hyderabad will recognise the two gateways on either side. These days traffic just thunders through it. It's quite unpleasant, but this is how it used to be, and this is why Wajid Ali Shah should be celebrated as a musician, a musical director, an actor, and he actually had the will to carry these things through. They cost a huge amount of money. We're looking at lakhs of money to put on a performance like this. And of course the British didn't understand what was going on. Firstly, because they hadn't been invited. Secondly, they wouldn't have understood it had they been invited. So all they could say was, you know, that the king is always busy with his musicians and his fiddlers and his wives. It was a gulf of incomprehension. And talking earlier, as Divya was, about the Ganga Jamna Tehzeeb, and you know, the mixture, the harmonious mixture at the time. And this shows Wajid Ali Shah celebrating Vasant, the Hindu spring festival, when everyone is wearing yellow. He's on a pleasure boat in the Gumpti, and I have to say the boat actually looks, it's slightly perilous. You can see the waves are lapping around the bottom. But that's not the point. We've got to remember that the Gumpti was incredibly busy during the Vabi days. All of those buildings that we see along it now had water gates. So you come out of the water gate and you'd get onto your boat or your barge, and they would travel up and down from Musabag to Dilkusha. This is one of the occasions. And I don't know whether you can see it, but on the top deck there is an Englishman in a red jacket, and we actually know who he was, and this was Sir William Sleeman. He was often known as Thuggy Sleeman because he'd actually done a lot of work in stamping out dacoitry and the thugs. But it was his really damning report on Awadh that did for Wajid Ali Shah, because when the Governor-General read it, and I have to say quite a lot of it I think is fiction, he said, right, that's it, we're annexing Awadh. So it's quite extraordinary that Wajid Ali Shah should have asked Sir William Sleeman to be with him on his boat to celebrate spring. Nevertheless, this is what happened, and it was interesting to meet descendants of William Sleeman who confirmed that that was indeed their ancestor. This, I think, is probably one of the pictures we all know. It's frequently reproduced, and it's actually in the Hussainabad picture gallery. It's probably a copy of a painting by an English artist. I think the original has been lost, and I think the original was probably by George Duncan Beechey, who we know was the court artist. He was a Scottish man. He was the court artist until 1852. But one thing we don't know, and if anyone can enlighten me, I'd be very grateful, why is the king's breast exposed? I have asked many, many people. I've asked people both in Lucknow, Delhi, and in London. The only thing we can think of is that he was a very passionate man. He was a poet, as you know, and it seems to be something to do with bearing his breast in the romantic sense, wearing his heart on his sleeve, and he continued to do this right to the end of his life, as we shall see. So it's a marvellous portrait, and as I say, it's probably the one we know best, the representation of the king. But this is why I was so pleased to be sent this, because here is a photograph, and he's obviously still very much king, probably a little after the other portrait was painted. And this was like a carte de visite, which he'd sent to the Nizam of Hyderabad. And I love this picture because you can see what he's doing. He's actually puffing himself up rather like a pigeon to show that he's even bigger and even more important than he would be if he didn't. We don't know who the photographer is, but it's a very interesting picture. And sadly, coming to the last picture, this is the Sultan Khana. And as I explained, Wajid Ali Shah spent the last 30 years of his life just outside Kolkata at a place called Motia Borj. The British called it Garden Reach, but it was called Motia Borj because there had been an old observation tower there. And what he did was try to recreate the Lucknow which had been taken away from him. There are lots and lots of buildings. This is the only one that survives. It's now the headquarters of the South Eastern Railway. It's been greatly altered, but this is where the king lived principally, and in one of the ground floor rooms he died. And one of the things he did create was a new menagerie. He was passionate about animals. He had a huge menagerie in Lucknow, and one of the first things the British did on annexation was to auction off all of the animals on the banks of the Gumti, which had seen all those pleasure boats going up and down. And it was a highly traumatic scene, and people actually claimed they could see tears in the eyes of the elephants. So because this menagerie had been taken away from him, he recreated another one in Calcutta. He didn't really care what he spent on exotic animals, and he actually said at one point that he liked his animals. In fact, he loved his animals more than his family. And by this time he'd fallen out with many of his wives. I'm sorry to say that he was actually quite nasty to a lot of them. He kept them very short of money. There were all kinds of complaints, and ironically the wives, because they were now pensioners of the British government, complained to the British residents. So we know quite a lot of what went on. So here he is with his animals and his disgruntled wives and his unhappy children. One of these days a tiger escapes from the menagerie. It's a Bengal tiger, so it can swim, and what it does is to swim across the river, which is quite narrow at this point, the Hooghly, and it gets into the botanical gardens and it attacks one of the German keepers there. And there's tremendous fuss. The man is not actually killed, but there's a huge amount of symbolism going on here, the idea of a wild beast in the centre of Calcutta, in confined circumstances. And I think to some extent it's an analogy of the king himself, a magnificent, talented person, but confined, caged, longing to break out. And I think with that I will leave you, and I'm greatly looking forward to the rest of the evening. Thank you.